Vegetative state. I pulled the ventilator. Everyone called me a monster. But 3 days later, his mistress sent me a video. He was alive and well, picking up women at a nightclub. Just wait and see how he'll use that video to seize his family assets. Leaving his parents begging on the streets while I sip champagne in a spacious 2,100 sq ft penthouse. Enjoying the show, vegetative state, and I pulled the ventilator. Mark Miller suffered an accidental fall from a high rise. Vegetative state. I chose to directly pull his ventilator, leaving him to his fate. At the same time, I claimed his parents' estate for myself and fled far away with my daughter. Soon after, Henry and Margaret Miller ended up on the streets, and the news of them accusing their daughter-in-law of neglecting them went viral. Meanwhile, I woke up in a spacious 2,100 sq ft penthouse, feeling completely at ease, facing the reporters' relentless questions. I was fearless, openly recounting the various atrocities that family had committed against me. If they've stooped so low, why don't they go to their own son for help? To my surprise, Henry and Margaret Miller retorted, "You were the one who insisted on pulling the ventilator back then, causing our son to die in the hospital." I immediately released a video. "Oh really? He was out clubbing with his girlfriend last night." Standing by Mark Miller's hospital bed, I was expressionless. "Audrey, are you really going to pull Mark Miller's ventilator? He still has a glimmer of hope." 6 months prior, Mark Miller had fallen from a high rise in an accident. Vegetative state. It had been over half a year, and I no longer wanted to waste our time. It was time to end our misery. Thud. Margaret Miller instantly knelt before me, banging her head against the floor, begging me to extend her son's life. "Enough. I can't afford any more. If you have the energy and time, you continue treating him." Seeing this, the relatives all chimed in, "But that's your husband." I looked down at Mark Miller on the hospital bed. No one knew that the reason he was in this state was because he had been having an affair at his mistress's house. He accidentally got caught by his mistress's husband and fell from a height. In my previous life, Henry and Margaret Miller deceived me, making me truly believe he had fallen during high-rise construction work. For 30 whole years, I supported this family. But Henry and Margaret Miller still targeted me, and I ultimately died by suicide due to depression. Reborn into this life, I chose never to consume myself from within. Instead, I would resolutely consume those who wished to leech off me. "Well, isn't he still your relative?" I glanced at those relatives who stood by and offered unsolicited advice, then unceremoniously took out the family assets transfer agreement. "Henry, Margaret, sign this contract. Take the money Zoe is entitled to as your granddaughter, and well leave." Henry Miller immediately knelt, grabbing my feet. "If you leave, who will take care of us in our old age?" I snorted coldly, "Let your warm-hearted relatives take care of you. After all, I've noticed how invested they are in other people's family matters." They fell silent after I finished speaking. "I know. You're doing this because you've found someone new outside," Margaret Miller muttered to herself, inadvertently completely ruining my reputation. "Stop talking nonsense. Just sign it." Henry and Margaret Miller finally signed their names, and I smiled with satisfaction. "I won't touch the money belonging to you too. It's all for your granddaughter." After that, I finally breathed a sigh of relief. That evening, back home, I contacted Ethan, a private detective, and had him stake out near the hospital to take some photos for me. And the subject of these photos was none other than Mark Miller. Mark Miller had actually woken up a long time ago. He would lie in bed playing dead whenever I visited. When I wasn't around, he lived a normal life. In the past 6 months, the money spent at the hospital amounted to over $500,000. I didn't even have to ask. I knew H transferred the money into his own name now. I no longer wanted to play along with their charade. That night, a video of Mark Miller, fully recovered, clubbing at a bar, was sent to my phone. The next day, I woke up early and followed my routine, taking my daughter to school. But as soon as I arrived at my daughter's preschool, a group of reporters blocked my path. They pointed their cameras at my daughter and directly asked, "Do you know your father was killed by your mother? Are you just going to abandon your in-laws and let them fend for themselves?" I firmly shielded my daughter behind me, protecting her from any negative influence. Everything happening today is entirely the Zhao family's own doing. My answer was firm and clear, making everyone present turn their heads. They had no idea of the true meaning behind my words. One moment, I had just ushered my daughter into the preschool entrance. The next, Henry and Margaret Miller emerged from some corner. They moved quickly, almost snatching my daughter away, and these reporters were their cover. What are you doing? Seeing their scheme exposed, they became enraged and embarrassed. Margaret Miller even sat directly on the ground, slapping her thigh and wailing about injustice. Oh no, I have nothing left now. This woman killed my son, and now she wants to take away my only granddaughter. What am I going to do? Henry Miller glared at me sideways. I told you long ago. She's a jinx. If it weren't for her, our family wouldn't be shattered. Henry and Margaret Miller had no shame left. Resorting to throwing a tantrum, the reporters on the scene also chimed in, collectively accusing me of being cold-hearted. What did you say when I just gave birth to Zoe? When I challenged them like that, both of them dared not speak because they were in the wrong. Mark Miller was the only son in the family, raised like a prince since childhood. Henry and Margaret Miller had a strong preference for a son, wanting me to give birth to a boy with my first pregnancy, but ultimately, things didn't go as planned. And I gave birth to Zoe. Just because I had a daughter, the whole family gave me the cold shoulder. Margaret Miller even neglected me during my postpartum confinement period, and even tried to abandon my daughter when I wasn't looking. And now they were putting on a show of genuine emotion in front of me. It was sickening. You almost threw Zoe away before, and now you want to take her back? Who knows if you're even sincere? Mark Miller owned a considerable amount of property. According to the law, only Zoe had inheritance rights. So a large part of why the old couple wanted to take Zoe back was for the money. I wouldn't give them that chance. The old couple exchanged glances, their eyes full of calculation, seeing their protests were futile. They could only give up. Just then, a reporter watching from the sidelines, who loved to stir up trouble, quickly said, "Why not let the child choose? Children don't lie." I rolled my eyes at him. The child is too young. I don't want her involved in such a situation. I shifted my gaze back to Margaret Miller's face. The only one who can contend with me for custody is Mark Miller. Henry and Margaret Miller froze for a moment, then retorted, "You're heartless. My son's body is barely cold, and you're mocking him." I scoffed, "Is your son really dead?" Henry and Margaret Miller were even more shameless and despicable than I had imagined. Yesterday, they had jointly told the doctors to pull the ventilator in front of all the reporters. At the same time, they tearfully accused me of being cold-blooded and heartless in front of the cameras. Now, I had become the culprit in everyone's eyes, but I was the one who initially paid $500,000 for Mark Miller's treatment. In my previous life, Henry and Margaret Miller colluded with Mark Miller to fake his death, swallowing up my $500,000 in inheritance. They even worked me to death. In this life, I wanted to see if they would try the same trick again. Yesterday, with so many people watching, we pulled his ventilator. You can question us. But are you going to question the media too? I've never questioned the media. I spoke unhurriedly, slowly, watching Henry and Margaret Miller's faint expressions. It's just that your son just died yesterday, and you already have time to come here. A typical parent wouldn't have such strong psychological resilience. I scoffed, or perhaps you wanted to pull Mark Miller's ventilator from the beginning, but you weren't willing to bear the infamy, so you made me the villain. Henry and Margaret Miller were rendered speechless and could only give up. They hurried away from the preschool entrance with the reporters, watching them leave. I sighed deeply. But just as I turned, a reporter holding a camera blocked my path. "I want to hear your side of the story." By now, our family's situation had become the hottest topic of discussion in Sterling Heights. All the reporters were investigating from Henry and Margaret Miller's perspective. Some just wanted to look for a breakthrough. So Ethan approached me. He was convinced I had some major bombshells, but looking at him, I couldn't bring myself to trust him. Maybe he was setting up entrapment, trying to see if I truly had evidence, to avoid tipping them off. I quietly had the private detective track and photograph Mark Miller. As for me, I settled everything during this time, so every now and then, I would receive photos and videos of Mark Miller frequenting bars and nightclubs. Mark Miller was incredibly brazen. He was still active right here in Sterling Heights, faking his death here and continuing his activities here. He truly had no fear. I quickly converted the money I got from Margaret Miller into real estate, to prevent them from trying to claim it. My daughter, Zoe, was also transferred to my parents' place, for Audrey's parents to look after. I was entangled with the Zhao family, and I didn't want my daughter involved. Unexpectedly, half a year passed in the blink of an eye. During these 6 months, surprisingly, Henry and Margaret Miller didn't come looking for me again. I figured they were desperately trying to guard the news of their son's fake death, so they had to keep their mouths shut. The online buzz gradually died down. Just when I thought everything would end without a ripple, explosive news broke online. It was like dropping a depth charge into calm waters. Shocking! Mark Miller's ID information hasn't been cancelled, and the cemetery plot is empty. This post quietly climbed onto the social news section late one night. Meanwhile, another group of people found Mark Miller's parents. They were now living in squalor and begging under a bridge, and I, the wicked woman in their words, re-entered the public eye, you despicable woman. A rock wrapped in a threatening letter shattered my window. I opened the door and saw it was Henry and Margaret Miller. Compared to half a year ago, they had undergone a drastic change. They were reeking and disheveled, and their eyes were clouded. Henry and Margaret Miller looked emaciated, as if they hadn't had a proper meal in a long time. Seeing me, they instantly dropped to their knees. Margaret Miller clung to my leg. Audrey, please save us. You've reduced your in-laws to this state. Yet you're living in such a nice house. A reporter opened my front door and started snapping pictures wildly inside. Margaret Miller stormed in and lay on my couch, refusing to move. Henry Miller went straight to the kitchen, rummaging for food. Just then, a man walked out of the room. Henry and Margaret Miller were shocked to see him. Who is this man? I chuckled softly and casually linked my arm with Kevin's. Just because your son died, does that mean I'm not allowed to find another partner? Margaret Miller angrily punched Kevin's arm. You adulterers. My son hasn't even been officially declared dead yet. Then why hasn't he been? The answer was almost obvious, but Margaret Miller ultimately spoke in a cold voice and said no more. Mind your own business. Margaret Miller suddenly started yelling curses. I don't care. Give me money now. I'll leave if you give me the money. At this point, I carefully observed their clothing. If they were just putting on a show for me, there was no need to go to such an extent. It was clear they genuinely hadn't had money for a long time. If Mark Miller and they had truly reached an agreement, he wouldn't treat them like this. Could it be that Mark Miller betrayed the old couple after using them? I didn't know the current situation, but I knew that the evidence of Mark Miller faking death could only be used once. Margaret. Suddenly, uncharacteristically, I knelt and helped her up from the ground. Since leaving home, I've earned a little money, considering how you looked out for me before. I want to repay you. Margaret Miller was somewhat flustered by my sudden kindness, but she still managed an awkward smile. That night, the old couple stayed at my place. Kevin, whom I had hired to provoke Henry and Margaret Miller, naturally left. Late that night, I watched their movements on the surveillance cameras at AM. Margaret Miller mysteriously pulled out her phone and made a call. Son, we've found Audrey's house. Give me and your father some time, and we'll definitely trick the money out of her for you. After saying that, Margaret Miller humbly pleaded, please don't abandon me and your father. I smiled with relief. It was just as I expected. Mark Miller was the true monster. For money, he could abandon his family, even neglect his own parents. In that case, I would let them expose their true colors. The next day, at the breakfast table, I voluntarily offered a sum of money to Henry and Margaret Miller. Actually, there was something I didn't tell you at the time. This money is Mark Miller's compensation. That year, he fell from the top floor, suffering comminuted fractures throughout his body. I used my inheritance and personal savings to treat him, only to end up with nothing. Later, I learned he had climbed over the wall from his mistress's house. That day, he wasn't doing high-rise construction work at all. He was having an affair afterward. The company paid out compensation on humanitarian grounds. I had kept it hidden before, but now, I would use this $200,000 to lure him out. In the past 6 months, Mark Miller probably didn't have much money left. With such a tempting offer in front of him, how could he not be excited? Indeed, upon hearing I had money, Henry and Margaret Miller were thrilled, urging, give it to us quickly. I paused for a moment. But I have one condition. I'll only give you cash. Henry and Margaret Miller exchanged glances, then sighed. Is that all? No problem. They didn't know that I had secretly frozen all the Zhao family's bank accounts. If Mark Miller wanted this money, it had to be a face-to-face transaction. As agreed, I stacked all the cash in front of them. Take it. Henry and Margaret Miller hesitated but couldn't resist taking the money. Henry, Margaret, you've seen that I have a new life now, and you've taken the money. Are you leaving now? Sure enough, money makes the world go round. Henry and Margaret Miller took the money and left shortly after. I contacted Ethan, the private detective, to follow them. Finally, after failing to deposit the money at multiple banks, they arrived at a coffee shop. Henry and Margaret Miller were waiting for Mark Miller. I immediately informed Ethan. the reporter who had offered to collaborate with me back then. I had stayed in touch with him for the past 6 months, and now that there was a new development, he quickly rushed to the scene. However, he waited for 3 full hours, and no one showed up. Are you sure they're waiting for Mark Miller? Ethan sounded distrustful, but at this moment, besides Mark Miller, I couldn't imagine who else Henry and Margaret Miller could be waiting for here. Shortly after, a woman walked into the coffee shop. She was fully covered, not wanting anyone to see her face. Her abdomen was slightly protruding, suggesting she had been pregnant for a long time. Uncle, Auntie, the woman greeted Henry and Margaret Miller, and she looked familiar no matter how I looked at her. Here's the money. The woman was about to leave before Henry and Margaret Miller could finish speaking, but in the next second, I recognized her. She was Tiffany, Mark Miller's mistress. She was pregnant. Ethan quickly snapped pictures, trying to capture her appearance. Tiffany had disappeared as if into thin air after Mark Miller's fall, and it turned out she was pregnant. She carried the pregnancy to such an advanced stage without having an abortion, and Henry and Margaret Miller were so intent on giving her money. She must be pregnant with a boy. Thus, I suspected Mark Miller was nearby. I started searching for him in the crowd. If Mark Miller took the money today, who knew when I would see him again? Suddenly, in the corner, a man pretending to sweep the floor with a broom was him. I suppressed the excitement in my heart and exchanged a look with Ethan. He understood immediately. After all, our goal today was to catch Mark Miller. I told Ethan to point the camera at me. Then, I lunged forward and directly knocked Mark Miller down with my body. Ethan appeared and shoved the camera right in his face. Mark Miller, you've finally shown your face. Mark Miller tried to resist, but I pinned him down hard. I used almost all my strength. Mark Miller, there's no escaping now. Seeing me pin Mark Miller down, Henry and Margaret Miller also crowded around, even trying to cover his face, but it was too late. Ethan not only recorded the entire thing but also started a live stream. Now, everyone online was following our perspective, together exposing Mark Miller's lies and deception. Damn it. How are you so strong, you wicked woman? I remained unmoved, with only one thought in my mind. If all my efforts were in vain today, this life of mine reborn would be completely ruined. Ethan, quick, call the police. Ethan wasn't in much better shape than I was. Henry and Margaret Miller and Tiffany were trying to snatch the camera from him, and his phone, used for the live stream, had been violently smashed to the ground, shattered into pieces. The scene was a complete mess. Mark Miller tried to fish in troubled waters. He wanted to get away before everything was completely exposed, but it was too late. By the time Mark Miller finally managed to push me off, the police were already at the door. The coffee shop entrance was sealed. No one could enter or exit without their permission. Mark Miller was utterly dumbfounded. Because of his greed, his whereabouts were fully exposed. And in my heart, I felt a surge of triumph. Ah! At that moment, Tiffany's shriek quickly silenced the surroundings. Ah! Tiffany! Your leg! I looked in the direction of the sound. A large pool of blood appeared between Tiffany's thighs. Based on my experience, that amount of bleeding meant either a miscarriage or she was going into labor soon. Although I disliked Tiffany, I hadn't expected such an accident to befall her. Everyone stopped what they were doing and hastily lifted her onto the ambulance. Mark Miller tried to follow the ambulance but was stopped by the police. What are you doing? You still have things to explain. You can't leave. He glared at me fiercely, as if he wanted to devour me whole. In my previous life, I might have been afraid of him, even afraid to meet his gaze. But now? I looked directly into his eyes. Go on. Try to run now. Mark Miller gave me the middle finger, with a defiant look. What can you do even if you catch me? Mark Miller scoffed. I haven't broken any laws. I slowly walked towards him. Then don't worry about it. I'm already happy that you've been caught. The police didn't give him a chance to continue arguing with me and directly dragged him into the police car. Because I was the one who called the police, I also had to be interrogated at the police station. I clearly explained the entire sequence of events. The interrogating officer was even surprised. Such a thing actually happened. I smiled helplessly. Of course, there's nothing new under the sun. While the police pitied me, they also expressed their concerns. Because the mere act of faking his death alone couldn't convict him, I had already anticipated such a result, but I couldn't react yet. I had to take things one step at a time. News came from the hospital during our interrogation that Tiffany and the baby were in the emergency room. Neither the child nor the mother would likely survive. Hearing this news, Henry and Margaret Miller, in the next room, completely broke down. "I told you, she's our family's jinx. Now I'm definitively not having a grandson." I couldn't help but scoff, even at death's door. These two were still fixated on having a grandson. It was ridiculous. Besides Henry and Margaret Miller clamoring for my demise, Mark Miller was even more arrogant. "Warn her for me. If I don't get out, or if I do, I'll definitely kill him." After being warned twice by the police, Mark Miller remained unrepentant, still uttering curses. Ultimately, he was detained for 15 days for provoking law enforcement. Ethan and I were immediately released. After leaving the police station, Ethan rushed back to his company to edit the latest news. As for me, I went home to strategize for the next wave of public opinion. In fact, I had been working on this for a long time. Over the past 6 months, I had compiled a detailed report, over 100 pages long, about Mark Miller's infidelity. It was all to seal his fate at this very moment. Although it might involve some illegal filming, I had already paid with my life, so I was fearless. Mark Miller and I met through a blind date initially. I genuinely thought he was unremarkable in appearance, a worker often doing high-rise construction work, but he seemed dependable. However, I never expected that everything that happened during our blind date was merely his disguise. He just wanted to trap me, an only child. After marriage, he gradually revealed his family assets. They were no worse than mine. When I asked him why he had hidden his family background from me, he casually replied, "I was doing it for your own good." Did you want to be called a gold digger? At the time, I was swayed by his sweet talk, immersed in the beautiful fantasy I had crafted for myself. Looking back now, it was terrifyingly foolish. All that talk about considering my feelings was a lie. His sole purpose was to make me spend my money on household expenses after marriage. Mark Miller was not short on money at all. His actions were completely selfish. In my previous life, after he became paralyzed, I devoted myself completely to this family. But after I died from exhaustion, he quickly remarried and even abandoned our daughter after taking her from me. Mark Miller's relationship with me was a complete deception. Just thinking about how that family tricked me out of everything in my previous life, at this moment, my resolve only strengthened. I packed the detailed report I had prepared, along with the pre-edited marketing copy, and sent them to Ethan. After I paid tens of thousands of dollars, that same night, the detailed report caused a huge stir. In this era where everyone online is a judge, Mark Miller and Tiffany became synonymous with scumbag and heartless woman, and after a night of spreading, the hospital where Tiffany used to work officially announced her termination. Mark Miller had already been jobless, so there was naturally no concern in that regard. But some passersby provided me with a lot of third-party evidence in the comments section. For example, a month after his euthanasia, he miraculously appeared at a hiking club event, mingling with female guests and laughing gaily. Currently, these things were far from achieving my desired outcome. At this moment, what I wanted was far more than just this. The next morning, Ethan sent me news that something had happened to Tiffany. Her baby was gone. Although she had a brush with death, she had lost her uterus. Upon hearing this, I couldn't help but sigh. Although she had done things to hurt me, as a fellow woman, I knew how devastating losing a child and her uterus would be for her. But I couldn't help but wonder what expression Mark Miller would have upon hearing this news. Would he break down in tears? Or would he just listen indifferently? After all, to him, having a son was far more important than anything else. But compared to Mark Miller, Henry and Margaret Miller clearly knew about this sooner. Their son was still imprisoned, yet they came to me, claiming all the blame would fall on me now. I wouldn't tolerate them anymore. I immediately called the police. "You come once, I'll call once. You come twice, I'll call twice. I won't let you off the hook." I slowly leaned close to Margaret Miller's ear and calmly said, "Don't worry. I'll haunt your family like a vengeful spirit." Henry and Margaret Miller broke out in a cold sweat, startled by my abnormal behavior, dropped dead. "Why don't you just die?" Margaret Miller punched me, and I felt that she had no power left, only able to vent her rage on me. Seeing this, Ethan was a little worried. He said he had followed many people trapped in dire situations. Once pushed to a certain point, they are capable of anything. I had also considered such a potential danger, but for the sake of my future and my daughters, I had no way to retreat. Tiffany didn't die and was released from the intensive care unit ICU. Mark Miller's 15 days in detention were unusually quiet, so compliant that I even suspected he was planning a major move. The more this happened, the less I could act impulsively. Playing it by ear was the safest approach, however. I didn't wait for Mark Miller. Instead, I waited for another man. That day, after Ethan and I finished discussing our next steps at the coffee shop and stepped out, I was taken hostage by a man. Everyone, get back. The man held a knife in his hand and ruthlessly left a scratch on my neck. The scene was quickly isolated, and I was dragged into the coffee shop. He used the knife to threaten everyone away. Enduring intense pain, I asked him, "Who are you? And why are you treating me like this when I have no grudge against you?" Hearing me say that, the man became even angrier. "No grudge? You're our whole family's enemy. You caused my wife to lose her baby, and you're still pretending to be innocent here." He was Tiffany's husband. Then have you ever considered that the child might not have been yours? Your deeply loved wife was actually having an affair with my husband. The man, whose mind was clearly unhinged, dragged me more wildly. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. My mind went almost blank. He dragged me into the coffee shop for only one purpose: to avoid being shot in the head by a sniper. What do you want? Tell me. I can. I was about to negotiate with him when, at that moment, I saw Mark Miller among the crowd watching outside. He was watching me with his hands in his pockets and a slight smile on his lips, chilled to the bone. I dared not move. The onlookers called the police for me. By the time the police arrived, my white shirt was already soaked red with blood, due to excessive blood loss. My vision was blurring, and I didn't even have the strength to stand, based on my understanding of Mark Miller. He was definitely involved in this, but he always managed to clear himself and stay out of trouble. Just like now, he was only 100 meters away from me. But he was secretly manipulating Tiffany's husband. You forced my wife and child to their deaths. Tiffany's husband's knife plunged deep into my collarbone. The spurting blood blurred my vision. I could no longer feel the pain. I could only place my hope in the police. The police arrived at the scene, and facing the awkward position, they were at a loss for what to do. Mark Miller raised his hand. "I'm her husband. I want to go in and talk to her." After getting the assailant's permission, Mark Miller entered. I watched him slowly approach the assailant and me, and I couldn't help but feel afraid. "Audrey, don't be afraid. I'll get someone to save you." I knew what he meant. No one was coming to save me at all, and his presence here was to supervise the assailant killing me. He wasn't there to ensure I wouldn't be harmed. He was there to ensure I would die. I struggled to lift my hand and grabbed the assailant's wrist. "Are you sure you want to do this? You're completely being used by Mark Miller." But at this moment, the assailant wouldn't listen to anything I said. He screamed hysterically, dangling me like a rag doll. "I don't care. I just want my wife and child back." He was completely immersed in the pain of losing his child, unable to break free. Any explanation from me sounded utterly meaningless to him. Seeing I had no chance of survival, Mark Miller intentionally opened his phone and started a video call with my daughter. In the video, accompanying Zoe were not Audrey's parents, but Henry and Margaret Miller. They held Zoe with hypocritical expressions. "Mommy's very busy with work outside and probably won't be back for a long time." Little did they know, I was on the verge of death. "Mark Miller, you're an absolute monster." I cursed. Mark Miller cut off the video call and waved at me with a smile. "Audrey, don't worry and go. I'll take care of Zoe. She'll be fine. I'll even inherit your share of the inheritance." My eyes widened, but there was nothing I could do. Just then, the assailant holding me hostage wavered. "So what about me? What do I get?" Before Mark Miller could calm him down or persuade him to continue his dirty work, he was stabbed violently. The knife went straight through Mark Miller's waist. Bang. Outside, after the sniper shot, the assailant fell to one knee. The police quickly surrounded me. Separating the three of us, I was sent to the hospital for treatment and successfully saved my life, but they weren't so lucky. One of Mark Miller's kidneys was severely damaged, and after falling to his knees, the assailant plunged the knife into his own neck and died instantly. Henry and Margaret Miller, seeing Mark Miller's plot exposed, both jumped into the river and committed suicide. They even tried to drag my daughter with them, but Audrey's parents fought desperately to save her. Tiffany, seeing herself entangled in so many issues, was plagued by online rumors and gossip. She ultimately chose to end her own life. While I was recovering in the hospital, listening to Ethan recount everything that had happened during this time, I could only sigh. It's finally over. This whole farce had shockingly cost for lives. Mark Miller didn't die, but he was left disabled. For his alleged conspiracy to commit murder, he would face 15 years in prison. After being kidnapped, my vocal cords were damaged, and I often couldn't speak. I could only listen to Ethan's retelling. I only have one demand now. I made a gesture and wrote down my wish on a piece of paper. Divorce Mark Miller. I had wanted to do this for a long time. As long as I was bound by this marriage, I would remain his captive. The outcome was predictable. He didn't agree. Do you really think I'm stupid? If we divorce, I'll be left with nothing. I furiously slapped the table. If you don't divorce me, you'll still end up with nothing. Mark Miller casually picked at his nails, completely indifferent. You put me in prison, so I'll make sure you live as an estranged wife for me for the rest of your life. He was utterly unreasonable. As long as I don't die, sooner or later, when I get out, you're dead too. Mark Miller was completely capable of making good on his threats. Over the next few years, I often commissioned lawyers to negotiate with him on my behalf for the divorce. By then, it was already difficult for me to communicate with him, but he rejected all attempts. Just as I had put the divorce matter aside, things unexpectedly took a turn. Mark Miller had cancer. It was late-stage lung cancer, spreading incredibly fast. From diagnosis to being on the verge of death, less than 3 months had passed. He was released on medical parole and sent to the hospital. And as a family member, I saw him one last time, looking at his pale face. I said, "You're not faking it this time, are you?" Mark Miller gritted his teeth. "Get out. Don't come here to gloat." Perfect. Tonight, my marital status will change from married to widowed. Mark Miller was still holding on to hope, waiting for a lung transplant. He didn't care how much money it cost, as long as he could get a new lung. But I wouldn't give him that chance. I slowly reached out and placed my hand on his ventilator. As he stared in shock and panic, I pulled the plug on his ventilator. The oxygen supply from the ventilator stopped. Mark Miller's face slowly turned purple. His lungs were completely ravaged, and he had no chance of clinging to life. Mark Miller began to gasp violently, and eventually, both of his outstretched hands flailed wildly. And I just watched indifferently from the side. Mark Miller. I called his name. "Your time is up." Mark Miller frantically shook his head, reaching out, trying to grab me, but it was already too late. I turned and walked out of the intensive care unit ICU. For the final 3 minutes, I watched the expression on his face through the large window. It could only be described as a fate worse than death. Beep. Amidst the frantic beeping of the heart monitor alarm, Mark Miller finally stopped breathing. This time, there would be no faking death, no miracles. I let out a long breath and smiled with relief. After Mark Miller died, I took Zoe and left Sterling Heights, moving to a place where no one knew me. I started a new life. As for the past, I had no intention of telling Zoe about it, because Mark Miller and his family didn't deserve to occupy even a speck of Zoe's memory. But I would engrave this humiliation into my memory.